you fare, my loyal 9 patriots? Our history has been stolen, denied, and delayed from the truth from reaching the public. The history I speak of is a history that has been almost permanently altered, but not just by the communist left, but by historians who are supposed to preserve and shed light on the truth, so that no matter the atrocity that has been committed, no matter the political motives, the truth will reign supreme and ensure horrific moments in history do not repeat themselves. However, our history has been selectively edited by a group of historians, members of our government, and thus allowed to perpetuate into a web of lies that has become completely accepted by the general population. In this video, we're going to explore examples of communist cover-ups and how to this day, the truth is being delayed or denied. But more importantly, I'm going to expose to the world that at this very moment in time, we are witnessing and living through one of the greatest communist cover-ups of all time. So let's get started. To fully understand the tactics of communism, deflect, destroy, and deny, we must first understand the enemy that we face today that is deflecting, that is destroying, that is denying the truth from being uncovered, and that are actively trying to suppress the truth. While this is only going to be a small example, understand that this small example has rippling effects not just online, but in the classroom and even government operations. The first example I will describe is Wikipedia. While normally a decent source to obtain a basic understanding on a subject, Wikipedia has been slowly pushing the communist censorship tactic. For example, the Wikipedia community is considering deleting entries on mass killings under communism over claims of bias. Some Wikipedia editors reportedly disagree with the blaming of mass genocide on communist ideology. But more specifically, on a Wikipedia page titled Mass Killings Under Communist Regimes, in the section describing estimated murders, it states, "The estimates are based on sparse and incomplete data when significant errors are inevitable. The figures are skewed to higher possible values, and victims of civil wars, Holodomor, and other famines and wars involving communist governments should not be counted." In essence, they are downplaying the murder of millions of innocent lives to protect their flawed ideology. But if we examine deaths by fascism, obviously the Holocaust is counted in their death toll. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Looking at Grover Furr, who is a communist sympathizer, defender of Stalin, and naturally a professor who teaches at Montclair State University, Grover Furr has published over a dozen books on defending communism. Specifically, he has a book titled Khrushchev Lied, the evidence that every revelation of Stalin's crimes in Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party is provably false. And here is a quote from Grover Furr defending Stalin.
That I have yet to find one crime that Stalin committed. I know, they all say he killed 20 and 30 and 40 million people. It's bullshit. Goebbels said the big lie is successful, and this is the big lie.
The Holodomor is one of the most least discussed and most denied genocides because it does not fit the hammer and sickle agenda. In fact, most people are completely oblivious to what the Holodomor even is. However, it is not their fault. It is the fault of the failed state education system. Essentially, the Holodomor was a genocide of Ukrainians from 1932 to 1933, when Stalin began his collectivization of farms and forced private farms to be ran by the state. However, like most communist ideas, it amounted to a catastrophic failure, and with the end result being the genocide of 6 to 10 million Ukrainians. Conditions deteriorated so quickly, mainly because the state demanded not just grain, but all available food from the farmers and the peasant class. Moreover, the farmers and the peasant class ultimately resorted to eating grain from animal feces, tree bark, and even devolving into cannibalism and infanticide.
And that's exactly what they did in the 1920s. And as I said, they wiped out all their productive peasants. And then 6 million Ukrainians starved to death. They had posters. The Soviets produced posters in the 1930s that said, essentially, don't forget it's wrong to eat your children.
Stalin, citizens of the USSR, and even journalists knew of the brutality taking place in the Ukraine, but chose to follow the herd and not talk about it. Stalin even instituted a new law, quote, "Mention of the famine was criminalized, punishable with a 5-year term in the Gulag labor camps. Blaming the authorities was punishable by death." The number of murdered Ukrainians was so large that in 1937, approximately 4 years after the genocide, census takers were arrested and executed, all in an attempt to conceal the massive decline in the Ukrainian population. However, Stalin didn't just use murder as a way to cover up his genocide. In fact, he weaponized the media to further push the hammer and sickle agenda that no genocide occurred. For example, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, known liar, and Soviet apologist Walter Duranty executed his defense of the Soviet Union by crafting his words carefully about the Holodomor. For example, when describing the situation in Ukraine, he stated, "There is no actual starvation or deaths from starvation, but there is widespread mortality from diseases due to malnutrition." And because Duranty the journalist was a communist, he defended the actions taken against the Ukrainians by stating, quote, "But to put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs." And to truly understand the sinister character of Duranty the communist, he even admitted in a cable to William Strang, a British diplomat, that it is quite possible that as many as 10 million people have died directly or indirectly from lack of food. Again, we see the people who know the truth and consciously cover for the hammer and sickle agenda. Before the United States entered World War II, Soviet spies had already infiltrated the US government and were driving policy to support the communist Soviet Union. Most notably, President Franklin Roosevelt had an assistant named Harry Hopkins, who would later be given the nickname of Co-President. Harry Hopkins was credited for giving the Soviets our nuclear secrets through the Lend-Lease program, which was prioritizing aid to the Soviet Union before England and even the American military. However, once the United States had entered World War II and became heavily invested in the war, the communist cancer unfortunately had not left the US government. In fact, it had taken such a deep root that when the morale-boosting Doolittle raid that bombed Tokyo was complete, one of America's bombing crews that participated in the raid was being held as prisoners in the Soviet Gulag. The US government left the Doolittle raid bombing crew to be held in a Soviet prison, where they worked as laborers. The conditions were so horrendous, it left them malnourished and ill due to dysentery. That is how the Soviet Union paid back America, who helped them defeat Germany, who gave them billions of dollars worth of supplies, who put Russia before America. And what did the US government do? They wrote them off like a deal gone sour. Ultimately, Captain York, the commander of the imprisoned bombing crew, he and the rest of the crew were able to escape and return home. However, what does communist sympathizing websites like Wikipedia do? They deflect and they deny the truth by stating the crew had been secretly allowed to leave the Soviet Union under the guise of escape and return to the United States or US units elsewhere, by way of Allied-occupied Iran and North Africa. Because the cover-up must continue. It does not fit the hammer and sickle agenda. Unfortunately, the imprisonment of the American GIs doesn't end with the Doolittle raid boys. There have been numerous reports of American POWs held by the Germans during World War II. They had been supposedly liberated by Soviet forces and were sent off into the gulags with German POWs, never to be heard from again. Naturally, the US government knew of this and admitted so in a government investigation titled The Gulag Study. They state, Americans, including American servicemen, were imprisoned in the former Soviet Union. And for all those years, the US government has had in its possession information that Americans were being held, but did nothing to save them. The Katyn Forest Massacre is one of the most infamous Soviet atrocities committed, not because of the brutal execution of 25,700 Polish Army reservists on April 3, 1940, but because the Soviet Union blamed Germany for the massacre, and on cue, the American President FDR and the media ran cover for the Soviet Union, especially the New York Times. Even when clear evidence was presented to FDR and the Allied nations that the Soviet Union was responsible, they still refused to believe it. Moreover, anyone who reported that the Soviets were responsible for the murder were silenced or reassigned to a new position. Many spineless historians make excuses and say, well, this was done because America and England needed the Soviet Union to fight Hitler. This is a programmed response because it was the Soviet Union who needed America to fight Hitler, and it was the Soviet Union who implanted spies within the US government to protect the communists. These spies were in every level of the US government, including the President of the United States FDR and his co-president, Harry Hopkins. Later, on September 18, 1951, the United States House of Representatives established the Select Committee to conduct an investigation and study the facts, evidence, and circumstances of the Katyn Forest Massacre, known as the Madden Committee. The Madden Committee determined unanimously that the NKVD was responsible for the executions and recommended a trial before the International World Court of Justice. The question of an American cover-up was less clear-cut. Historians refused to accept that Stalin played the United States and the Allied nations. Historians refused to accept that Stalin orchestrated a web of subversion and deceit, which ultimately cost Western nations the lives of millions of her sons. And without fail, the communist sympathizer Grover Furr denies the Katyn Forest Massacre. With all the communist cover-ups that I have presented to you, how many do you believe saw justice? The Holodomor, no justice. In fact, Russia still denies it was a genocide and claims that it was, quote, the result of severe drought and forced farm collectivization, and that anyone who claims it was a genocide is contradicting historical facts. Deflect, destroy, deny. What about our servicemen who were held in Soviet prison camps like our boys from the Doolittle raid? Again, no justice. Almost all mainstream sources defend the actions of the Soviet Union and demonize anyone who steps away from the narrative. Deflect, destroy, deny. At least with the Katyn Forest Massacre, the Russian government has at least admitted to some wrongdoing, but it only took half a century, and you still have holdouts like Grover Furr that refuse to believe that the communists were responsible for the murder of more than 20,000 Polish army reservists. Deflect, destroy, deny. Like all communists, they are immune to persecution. They are never held accountable, and the victims of communism, whether dead or alive, never see justice. Unless, of course, you believe justice is the erection of a memorial. Ask yourself this: with everything we know about COVID, the mystery potions, death rate among the vaccinated versus unvaccinated, the divisive rhetoric by the mainstream media that is causing citizens to attack fellow citizens, and even calling for the unvaccinated to be placed in camps, will they be held accountable? And just as important, what about the abuse of power by our government that has cost the lives and the destruction of lifelong family businesses? Will all these victims receive justice or just a memorial? Deflect, destroy, deny. Loyal 9 out.